All right, Tobin, you're facing everybody.
All right. Tobin Siebers is V.L. Parrington Collegiate Professor at the University of Michigan. Siebers is a distinguished and prolific scholar who has authored 10 books and served as editor for 3 more essay collections. In addition, he has authored over 50 essays. Siebers' work is highly interdisciplinary, growing from his foundation in literary criticism outward toward visual culture, aesthetics, ethics, and disability studies. This audience will be well versed in his monographs Disability Theory from 2008 and Disability Aesthetics from 2010. These are both major contributions that at once ground the field and the thinking of disability studies scholars and inject provocative new ideas. This panel has taken Siebers' work as the primary inspiration for gathering our papers and beginning our work. And I just wanted to offer a quote here that inspired the work of the scholars on the panel tonight. In Disability Aesthetics, Siebers asks, quote, "What would it mean to call a person sick without it being a disqualification? What would it mean to call an artwork sick without it being a disqualification? What is the relationship between these two questions?" We are collectively stimulated and challenged by Siebers' thinking, and we are so grateful for his presence and his engagement on this panel tonight. He's going to offer a response to the papers you've just heard, and then we'll open up the floor for a bit of a questions and discussion period.
Well, first I'd like to thank very much the group who brought me in. I never doubted that disability would be an important factor in music. I just never thought that my work would have anything to do with it. Disability studies has recently emerged to join other minority populations that make us look at the world in a more various way. Indeed, we are given points of view that are entirely different from the norm. We celebrate variation instead of sameness. My position is to see disability aesthetics as a key feature of modernism. The modern in art manifests itself as disability, and disabled bodies possess an aura that seems to satisfy the artistic desire for new, varied, and beautiful forms of appearance. Disability helps rethink the human. Disability aesthetics is the human activity most identifiable with the human because it defines the process by which human beings attempt to modify themselves. Visual culture entails not just what is visible, but a type of art. It is not limited to the phenomenology of perception, but to the phenomenology of perceiving art. A number of you here have picked up some of my ideas about art, and I am eager to see how far you might take them into the world of music. Joseph Strauss, for example, has done much to link the emergence of modernism with notions of idiocy and madness. This is striking because I have been working lately on what I call the aesthetics of human disqualification. Here the focus is on photography, and I happen to be working on a book whose very bad title at the moment is Disability and Photography. Here the focus is on photography and the way that images present us with the appearance of inferiority. Strauss's focus is not on images, but on the voices of mental illness and madness, amplifying an aesthetics of human disqualification to include voice over image. Strauss names a variety of modern forms of expression that mark an inferior and medicalized expression of sound, and he goes on to fit them to modern work. To name two, schizophrenia and the cover, really the cover illness, protest psychosis. The second is found in the work of Jonathan Metzl, who was my student actually at the University of Michigan, and he tracks how protest psychosis begins as a disease or illness that is captured by little old ladies, and eventually and it eventually becomes picked up by the civil rights movement and is then called protest psychosis. And where the little old ladies live, suddenly we have African Americans in prison. So we go from knitting, to African Americans being locked up. If you haven't read this book, it's a remarkable book, and it's a really engaging study in the transformation of a location or a site from one kind of impression to another that's wholly different. Strauss focuses on the fragmentation of consciousness that is a feature of modernism in all the arts, he claims. And this fragmentation opens us to a view of mental illness that fits with the aesthetics of human disqualification. He imagines modern music as schizophrenic and schizophrenics as a species of the modern artist. However, in Strauss and Jensen Milton, we also see suggestions of phenomenology, and that is what I would like to think about in part this evening, adding the work of Del Antonio and Grace, who used as well phenomenological approaches to the listening of neurodivergent autistic adults. The point is to understand how phenomenology limits disability aesthetics, whether visual or vocal, but more so how characteristic voices represent madness. Notice that I will focus on the visual, leaving you to the vocal, and opera will write vocal with a giant V. The theory of phenomenology locates visibility, indeed the possibility of visual culture, in the appearances of the life world. What appears is visible. Merleau-Ponty claims, and what appears falls under the rules of the phenomenology of perception. To be seen as an object, to be an object, the object must be perceived at once from a totality of perspectives. And this vision is achievable only by a single subject whose mobility and powers of perception favor a simultaneous view of the object from all sides. But one question concerns how the life world and disability uphold each other. Is complex embodiment necessary for there to be a life world? And does the inclusion of the disabled body, however complexly embodied, betray the life world? Merleau-Ponty's claims about art, objects, and bodies take a point of departure that seems to replay at first glance the ideal equation ensuring the disabled body as an aesthetic value in itself. If no distinction holds between the non-disabled and disabled body, then the focus lies on the body itself as the place most approximate to the art object, as well as to the production and appreciation of aesthetic value. An assembly of forces that captures the body aesthetic. And this is, I'm citing Merleau-Ponty here, the body is to be compared, Merleau-Ponty states, not to a physical object, but rather to a work of art, unquote. The appearance of the object is visible, its visible status as such, and its aesthetic value, nevertheless assume, quote, a subject who has an unmediated relationship to the object/site. And this unmediated relationship requires an able body capable of power, extreme mobility, and ironclad control that push its gifts beyond reality into the exercise of fantasy. Only by conceiving of the body as belonging to a mobile subject, capable of experiencing the object in rapid succession, indeed simultaneously, may the subject's body transfer its unity to the object and find it there. Here comes to light as clearly as one might wish the image of the able body required by Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, here grasping the unity of a cube. I could not grasp the unity of the cube without the mediation of bodily experiences. As I move round it, I see the front face, hitherto a square, change its shape, then disappear, while the other sides come into view, and one by one become squares. It is, on the contrary, by conceiving my body itself as a mobile object that I am able to interpret perpetual appearance and construct the cube as it truly is. The unity of the object would thus be conceived, not experienced, as the correlate of our body's unity, unquote. Any failure of the unity of the body, any fracture of its perfection, any blockage of mobility demonstrate the inadequacy of the body to protect its unity, to project its unity on the object. It exposes the presence of the disabled body in the place of the supposedly desired able body. And this disabled body makes it impossible to transfer the qualities thought necessary to the unity and wholeness of the object. The phenomenology of perception turns repeatedly as its underlying support to the example of the disabled person. This is something that's really remarkable about this book. It's full of people with head injuries, with amputation, with phantom limb problems. It's just peppered with them. And really, this is what provides the underlying support, of the book, is to the example of the disabled person, whether it is someone with a phantom limb or with an amputation. But Merleau-Ponty's discussion of the element of perception never includes these examples in themselves, because he shifts rapidly to their opposites, to persons often imaginary who display great ability and little hint of disability. While Merleau-Ponty sees the body as an aesthetic object, he never understands that disability represents the modern in art, nor that it provides artists with a critical resource for thinking in different ways about what a human being is. Disability presents increasingly as the key figure in the production and appreciation of modern art, one that is synonymous with aesthetic value in itself. Not only is this evolution crucial because it embeds the perception of disability in some of the most creative and valued practices in human history, but because it throws open the door to the work of disabled artists, whose images of disabled people and themselves must now take their place along other treasured visions of beauty.
Thank you very, maybe, I don't know, is this not on?
Yeah, that's my
Awesome.
first.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much for that response, Professor Siebers. We invite the audience to come forward with questions or comments, either for Professor Siebers or Stephanie or Joe. Please approach the mic and introduce yourself, if you would.
May I?
Yeah.
Tobin, thank you so much for that fascinating response. I actually have a somewhat narrow question for you that I've wanted to ask you for a long time. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the chronological or aesthetic boundaries of which you term modern. For us music folk, we usually think of the modernist period in music as beginning roughly 1908. Which I guess is not such a rough date. It's the date of the first works written without a key signature that no longer conform to the norms of traditional classical tonality. And so for us, modern means after the first decade of the 20th century, typically. You seem to have a much more expansive notion. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
Well, this is very interesting that you bring this up because this is the very question that I wanted to pose to you in session when I'm supposed to say something smart to the audience. But yes, you're right that I use a much broader and expansive idea of the modern, and it really goes back, to the thing of in the French context of Manet. Baudelaire, and others who fit into that category. So I really push it back into the the 19th century to keep company with those painters, and that's largely because disability aesthetics jumps off from the genre of painting in order to establish its claims, that and the plastic arts. Although I do think about the significance of sculpture, of the classical fragmentary sculpture that haunts in some ways what we think about when we think about disabled art, if you will. So that's my what I think about that rather long arc, if you will, that that I return to again and again. So that's a simple answer to the question, but it's because one begins to see strong hints of disability in those works of art, if you, and for me it also is punctuated by, of all people, my God, you don't want to have him in any book and use him as a point of departure, but Adolf Hitler, when he looked at the works that he found despicable,
Yes.
He named works that showed individuals who had distorted faces, that had coloration that didn't make sense, of individuals who were thought in one manner of speaking or another to be idiots, to have mental illness. And so this is a very, it's as if he sees the works, he's wrong, but he sees the works correctly, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
We suddenly see, when we suddenly see what he sees, then we know that we live in a world where disability has taken over, and he feels the same thing about modern art, that that he sees all of these examples and he wants to get rid of it, but of course those works of modern art come to dominate really what art is. No one thinks to throw out a Picasso, even though Hitler does. And so Hitler shows us, in a sense, what the future of the modern is through his distorted lenses, as it will. So that's a significant feature, or a kind of an endpoint, where we can begin to see how there's a bridge of sorts between what is retroactively seen as disabled and what our future sees as possibly a figure of disability.
Are there questions or comments from the audience members? Yeah, Jeanette, please come to the microphone and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jeanette Jones, and I have a question for Joe. So you talked a lot about the different, what kinds of hearers were in your paper, but you didn't really talk about what kind of hearing, and I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that, because when I think of schizophrenic hearing, I think of voices that nobody else hears, and the pieces of music that you talked about had the borrowing, but we're all hearing and recognizing those kinds of voices. So.
Right, so who hears these voices?
Right. Well, not who hears these voices, but how they're hearing them.
Right, and what way are they heard? Those are two sort of actually related questions. And my feeling is they're actually, the agents who hear these voices have a kind of aesthetic choice to make. And they can either hear the voices in a kind of medicalized mode, what I refer to as a sort of therapeutic mode, or they can hear the voices as a welcome instance of neurodiversity, essentially. And most analysts and theorists who confronted this music have tended to approach it in what I'm characterized as a therapeutic mode. So they found the voices to represent an unwelcome sort of diversity within the piece that they feel compelled to use all of the tools in their armamentarium to explain away. And that's been essentially the theoretical enterprise. Theorists have presented themselves as kind of therapists of the music, and they're going to use their medicalized, specialized tools. We'll call the guys with the white coats, because we have a problem here that requires a solution. However, it seems to me that other hearing, agential hearers in this music are not required to respond in therapeutic mode. There are other modes of appropriate response to these voices.
Okay, so if I can just follow up a little bit. So are you talking about, you're using the word hearing then to talk about a kind of interpretation?
Yes.
Okay, so that's a particular, okay.
Yes, but I'm also wondering.
So I'm
yes.
just interested in your use of the word hearing then to mean, it's an interesting sensory metaphor to connect
Right.
the word interpretation.
Right, I mean, but I mean it in a more literal sense too, which is I'm trying to infer how the piece itself hears these voices, and I guess by hears I do mean sort of understands and responds to. But these voices are heard sounding objects, and so the idea of respond to them, the conflation. Actually, maybe I'll ask you then. What seems problematic to you about the conflation of hearing and interpretation?
It means that you have to hear in order to interpret.
Right, but the hearing can be an inner hearing. It doesn't have to.
Right. So
right.
I guess that was.
Yes. Yeah, they hear, right, and that's the advantage of the conflation of hearing and interpretation, is it permits you to hear these voices. Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
But then, so
without
it's
the
inner
sound,
hearing,
yes,
but
right.
the whole audience is hearing the
Yes.
piece that's quoted. So
Yes.
it's not an inner hearing.
Right, it can be either one, right, it can be either one,
Sorry,
Right.
I'm giving you a hard time.
No, but it's interesting because in a sense, anytime you listen to music, you're hearing voices. I mean, voice leading is voices, and you're hearing those voices.
You're hearing it. I might not be hearing your voice, so I suck at hearing.
Well, yeah, you see, because we haven't given you the kinds of tools that you need to perform therapy on these pieces. And so maybe that's good. Maybe we've spared you that kind of therapeutic intervention.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, William Van Geest, University of Michigan. Professor Strauss, you mentioned something, you've mentioned the therapeutic response on the part of the analyst or the theorist, and you've mentioned other modes of experiencing these voices. Could you, I guess my question is two parts. Can you elaborate on those other modes? I think you mentioned celebration, kind of in a general sense. So yeah, number one, I'd be curious about more of those modes, and number two, I'd be curious if there's a way, as an analyst or as a theorist, besides the therapeutic mode, what would that look like?
I mean, it's a really great question. It's a very challenging question because music theory as a discipline has allied itself so closely to an insistence on coherence, organic wholeness, the health and integrity of the musical body, that it's hard to imagine how you could make theoretical utterances that don't do that in some sense. You know, you see a part that's dangling off in some way, and your instinct, if you're trained in this way, is to reattach it and to reestablish the health and integrity and wholeness of the body. But if you're committed to a notion of disability aesthetics, if that's something that you've learned to value, then you're going to have to find some way of using theoretical inquiry to celebrate, to abandon this faith in health and wholeness, and to embrace the diversity that music, like life, so often presents. And I do think that there are theoretical approaches, including some rather technical ones, that I think do that. So if you think of David Lewin's transformational theory, this is taking a little bit far apart, and with my apologies to Tobin Siebers, who I don't expect to be closely conversant with Lewinian transformational theory. There you have an analytical approach without norms that takes the local contexts, plural, as points of departure, without insisting on restoring or establishing some kind of harmonious whole. So it's a music theory without norms. And some people find that rather alarming as a notion, because usually music theory is about reestablishing normality. But music theory doesn't have to be like that.
This question, I think.
Bruce, can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, I'm Bruce Quaglio from the University of Utah. And this could prompt a response from Professor Siebers or Joe, or perhaps from Professor Dell'Antonio. Your choice of examples for hearing voices is really suggestive, and it's got me thinking about implications and consequences of that for later repertoire. So if the implication of hearing voices suggests a divided consciousness, which is implicating modernity in relation to disability, what do we do with the postmodern? What do we do with Berio, for example, and Sinfonia? Is that a sort of post-disableist aesthetic, or how do we situate that? Because it seems like the furthest consequence of what you're identifying really as the earliest incidence of that. So I don't know who wants to answer that.
Well, I'll just throw something off quickly, and that is that, what I'd like to see develop is an idea of the disability where we begin to think about disabled individuals as being able to recognize one another in a way that's different to previous models. So, currently, the first way of identifying the disabled person is, by the medical model, so that we see somehow, that the disability is lodged in the individual, and the doctor chooses to identify who's disabled and who isn't. Then the second model, which is the social model, and is a bit of a mess. Actually, if you look at it closely, but the idea of the social model is that you become disabled because you occupy a disabling environment. But if you ask where the knowledge is in that system, or where the consciousness is in that system, you really can't find it. There's no payback for the disabled person, really. So what we really need is something like the social model, but where the disabled person recognizes the disabling environment and is able to use it in order to, produce a system of recognition, so that I would be going down the street and I would look out and I would see another person. I would recognize that person as immediately disabled. And, the non-disabled people in the area, they wouldn't. Wouldn't it be wonderful to think that way? That we wouldn't have to be identified by doctors or by, some, how should I put it, some system that doesn't have any consciousness in it, but instead what we really see is a knowledge base that is shared among us, among disabled people. And we would use that, knowledge base, which wouldn't be possessed necessarily by non-disabled people. We would, possess and use it as a means of understanding our culture better, and we would then be of value to our culture when we, when we share that that knowledge. And we wouldn't necessarily share it only among ourselves, but with non-disabled people at all, as well. And so we would be, look at the world in a quite a different way, and the world would look at us in quite a different way, because we would really see, or we would really have a certain degree of knowledge that we had gathered from living in an unjust society, one that we would then understand better.